Peace be upon you. The Silent Ground. Part 18. Before Reason. Memory hook. To think at all, you need fee. Salam and peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Layak Siddiqui. I am the father of HOLOPHASE. Fee makes reality readable. We're still in undifferentiated fee, earning permissions. If you hear me smuggling space, time, energy, matter, or dynamics as primitives, treat it as an error. Now breathe with me. We have arrived at the quietest and strangest edge of all, the edge where the tool we are using to understand the universe turns around and asks what made the tool possible. For 17 parts, we have earned permissions. Not building a world yet, not telling the story yet, just earning the right to speak without cheating. We refuse to begin with a container called space. We refuse to begin with a river called time. We refuse to begin with a substance called energy or matter. We insisted on the holophase stance. Phi is the only primitive. Everything else is readout, licensing, constraint, certified structure. And we carried the firewall like a compass that keeps us from drifting into familiar stories. We learned that Phi is not a thing among things. We learned that Phi is not the outcome. It is possibility. We learned that in undifferentiated Phi, you do not get to say, this happened yet, because happened is already a story word. We learned that absolute Phi cannot be measured. Only differences can speak. We learned that Phi has no intrinsic dynamics. It is grammar before story. We learned that it is timeless and spaceless before containers. We learned it precedes the mind-matter split. We learned it is not stuff. It is not a substance or field. It is what makes stuff and field meaningful later. And now we reach the final permission, the one that is so close to you that it feels like it is about you more than about the cosmos. Because here is the uncomfortable fact. We have been reasoning this entire time. We have been making claims, drawing distinctions, saying, this is allowed, that is smuggling, saying, this follows, that contradicts, saying, if that were true, then this would happen. We have been using logic as if it were a clean ladder we can climb to reach Phi. So part 18 asks a question that sounds simple, but if you take it seriously, it shakes the floor under your feet. What gives logic its right to operate at all? What makes therefore meaningful? What makes same and different meaningful? What makes contradiction more than a noise? Because if Phi is the primitive of comparability, then logic is not the foundation of Phi. Logic is something built out of comparability. Logic is a kind of behavior that already assumes the possibility of comparison. That is the core claim of Part 18. Phi is the prerequisite of reason. All logic presupposes comparability. Let me say it again in even simpler words. You cannot think without this, not that. And this, not that, is Phi. If you can feel the weight of that, you can already sense why this part matters. Because if it is true, then Phi is not just a hypothesis inside logic. It is the condition that makes logic possible, which means you cannot step behind it. Any attempt to deny Phi uses Phi in the denial. Any attempt to replace Phi requires comparing the replacement to Phi. Any attempt to ground logic must already use the very thing it is trying to ground. So the aim of this part is not to be clever. The aim is to be honest about what we are doing when we reason. And to keep us honest, we will use a single, everyday analogy for this entire part, and we will return to it again and again until it becomes obvious in your bones. Here is the analogy. Imagine you walk into a quiet room with a friend. On the table, there is a pile of socks. Same brand, same color, mixed together. Your friend says, "Help me pair them." This sounds trivial, but it is the perfect picture of reason. Because pairing socks is not about substances. It is not about force. It is not about time. It is not even about counting yet. It is about comparison. You look at a sock. You look at another. You ask, do these match? Same stripe, same length, same wear, same shade. If they match, they belong together. If they don't, they don't. And if you could not perform that simple act, match, not match, you could not pair anything. You could not sort anything. You could not even begin. That room, that table, and that pile of socks is the birthplace of logic. Logic is sock pairing in its pure form, sorting patterns by sameness and difference. Now keep that image because we will use it to walk slowly into the deepest point of the argument. Start with the simplest logical move you know: identity. A is A. People say this is the most basic law of thought, but look at what it really means. To say A is to treat A as a stable target across a comparison. It means, when I point to A now and I point again, I'm pointing to the same A, not a different one. Identity is not a magical self-glue. Identity is a rule for matching. In the sock pile, identity is the rule that says this sock counts as itself when I re-encounter it, and it is not the other sock. I can track it as a unit in a sorting process. But how can you track without distinction? How can you track without a boundary between this sock and not this sock? Identity presupposes the possibility of difference. Then take the next simplest, negation, not A. Negation is also comparison. It is the act of drawing a line. On one side are cases that match A, on the other side are cases that do not match A. In the sock room, not A is every sock that does not match the sock you are trying to pair. Then take implication. If A, then B. Implication is also comparison. It is a rule that says, whenever a situation matches pattern A, it must also match pattern B. In the sock room, implication is the rule. If the sock has this stripe and this length, then it belongs to this specific category. If it matches these features, it must match that label. And contradiction? A contradiction is the failure of a matching rule to remain consistent. It is the situation where you attempt to sort, but your sorting collapses. You place the same sock in two incompatible piles under the same rule set. A contradiction is not a mystical badness. It is the breakdown of a comparability discipline. So already, logic begins to look less like a set of floating divine laws and more like a disciplined activity performed inside the space where comparison is possible. Now let's go deeper, because someone might object. Fine, logic uses comparison. But maybe comparison is derived from logic. Maybe comparison is just a special case of logical structure. This is the crucial moment. Because if comparison were derived from logic, logic could still be the foundation. But if comparison is more primitive than logic, then logic is downstream, a dependent structure. So we ask, can you define comparison without using comparison? Try. Define same without using not same. Define match without using does not match. Define equivalent without using any notion of correspondence. Define identical without distinguishing identity from non-identity. You will notice something immediately. Every definition of comparison uses comparison. Even the attempt to remove equals from mathematics just replaces it with isomorphic, equivalent, same structure, corresponds, maps to. Those are all comparison words. They are sock pairing in fancy clothing. This is not a small technical point. It tells you something profound about the architecture of thought. The ability to compare is not one tool among others. It is the condition that makes tools usable. Now let's make it painfully concrete. Try to make a decision without comparing. Not a big decision, a tiny one. Choose between two drinks. But do not compare taste. Do not compare health. Do not compare past experience. Do not compare cost. Do not compare how you feel now. Do not compare any reason at all. Just choose. If you truly remove comparison, the choice becomes meaningless noise. Even random requires comparison, because random selection still needs you to distinguish option 1 from option 2 and to map outcomes to options. Decision-making is comparison, and reasoning is decision-making at the level of ideas. When you reason, you're pairing claims with consequences, matching premises with conclusions, sorting possibilities into allowed and forbidden. Reason is structured selection. Structured selection is comparison. So the core claim becomes more believable. To think at all, you need phi. Because phi is the primitive capacity for this rather than that. And logic is just the disciplined choreography of this rather than that. Now let's address the most important why this matters point, because otherwise this sounds like a philosophical word game. If phi is prerequisite to logic, then phi is unavoidable. And that has two consequences, one liberating, one strict. The liberating consequence is this: we do not need to be embarrassed that the holophase program begins before physics. We are not trying to out-physics physics. We are trying to secure the conditions that make any physics speak coherently. We are trying to make sure the alphabet exists before we pretend to read a novel. And logic, like physics, is part of the novel. It is not the alphabet itself. The strict consequence is this: you cannot refute phi by pure logic, because pure logic is not pure. It is already built on comparison. Any logical argument you make has already assumed the possibility of sameness, difference, implication, and contradiction. It has already assumed phi. This is not a trick. It is the same kind of truth as this: you cannot see without some medium of seeing. You cannot deny the existence of perception without using perception. You cannot deny language without using language. Phi is what makes denial meaningful. Now, there is a delicate point here, and the firewall demands we say it carefully. We are not saying phi is a set of axioms in a logic textbook. We are not saying phi is itself a logical proposition. We are not saying phi obeys logic in undifferentiated form, because obeys is already dynamics-flavored language if you're not careful. We are saying something much cleaner. Comparability is presupposed by every consistent act of reasoning. Logic is a refined practice inside comparability. Phi is that comparability. So phi is pre-logical, not illogical, not anti-logical, but prior to the possibility of logic being stated as a system of rules. Now, remember the sock room. Let's return to it because it will carry us into prediction and falsification in a way that remains operational rather than mystical. Imagine a person who claims they have invented comparison-free sorting. They walk into the room, they look at the pile, and they say, "I can pair the socks without comparing them." You ask, "How?" They say, "I don't use sameness or difference. I just pair them." So you watch. And what do you see? Either they secretly compare, matching stripes, matching sizes, or they pair arbitrarily and call it pairing. If they pair arbitrarily, the result is not pairing. It is just placing socks together. It has no correctness condition. And here is the crucial thing. Logic too requires correctness conditions. A proof is not just a sequence of statements. It is a sequence where each step matches an allowed inference pattern. A valid argument is not just words. It is words that match an implication structure. A contradiction is not just two sentences. It is two sentences that match an exclusion rule. Reasoning is sock pairing with a rulebook. You compare steps to rules. You compare conclusions to requirements. You compare claims to evidence. You compare models to observations. Without comparison, validity evaporates. Truth evaporates. Meaningful evaporates. You may still have sound, but you no longer have sense. So here is an operational prediction, stated in the simplest language possible. Prediction. Every usable system of logic, every system that can actually guide reasoning, proof, or decision, will contain phi-like comparability somewhere inside it, either explicitly as equality and inequality, or implicitly as an equivalence notion, or silently inside the rule of inference itself. In other words, if it reasons, it compares, and we can make it sharper. If you attempt to design a logic that removes all comparative operators, you will reintroduce comparison in one of three places. In the identity of symbols, you must treat the same symbol as itself across steps. In the matching of rules, you must detect when a premise fits a rule pattern. Or in the equivalence of meaning, you must know when two expressions are the same claim under substitution. The sock pairing returns, always. Now falsification, because the firewall demands that every claim carry a way to die. Falsification. If someone produces a complete and practical logic system that can be used for proof and reasoning, and this system contains no form of comparison, not even implicit matching, not even identity tracking, not even rule pattern recognition, then the claim fails. If X happens, this claim fails. And we can add a second falsifier that is more experiential. If someone demonstrates a genuine act of thinking, an act of judgment, inference, decision, understanding, that involves no distinction between this and that, no recognition of sameness or difference, then the claim fails. If X happens, this claim fails. Now you might feel, but isn't the second impossible? Any description of thinking already distinguishes it from not thinking. Exactly, that is the point. The very attempt to imagine non-comparative thinking collapses, because imagination itself distinguishes. So the falsification is severe but fair. Show us a functioning reasoning that does not sort, a mind that does not pair socks. If it exists, we revise. If it doesn't, phi stands as prerequisite. Now we must state the scope and limits, because otherwise we will accidentally smuggle later content. Scope. This part is about undifferentiated phi, the permission layer. We are not yet explaining the full emergence of omega, kappa, and nu in the public layer. We are not deriving a physical law. We are not claiming a specific dynamics. We are simply securing the condition that makes any law, any inference, any therefore, meaningful. We are also not claiming that phi is a human invention. Comparability is not in your head as a preference. Your mind is one place where comparability is enacted, but the claim is deeper. Comparability is the condition for any coherent description whatsoever, including descriptions of worlds where no humans exist. In holophase language, phi is not anthropocentric, it is prerequisite. And now, because you asked for a story, not a fragment, let's let the story become intimate. Picture yourself again in that sock room, but now make it cosmic. Imagine you are not pairing socks, You are pairing experiences. You are pairing moments. You are pairing claims about what is real. When you say, this memory belongs to me, you are pairing the memory with a self pattern. When you say, this sound came from that source, you are pairing the perception with a cause pattern. When you say, this is the same person I met yesterday, you are pairing two appearances across a gap. When you say, this pain is worse than before, you are comparing intensities. Your entire life is a continuous activity of comparison. Even when you feel lost because you compare your current state to a desired state called clarity. Even when you feel peace because you compare the present to the prior turbulence and recognize the absence of conflict. Even when you meditate and attempt to stop thinking, what you call thoughts arising and letting them go is still distinction. Awareness is not blankness. Awareness is discriminating presence. So when we say phi is the foundation of logic, we are not saying something cold and abstract. We are pointing at the pulse beneath every meaningful moment, the capacity for difference. Now connect that back to the entire episode 13 arc, because we must keep the listener oriented. Episode 13 has two movements. First, undifferentiated phi, the silent ground, where we earn permissions and refuse to smuggle a world too early. Second, differentiated phi, the public layer, where change becomes readable under licensing, where omega, kappa, nu appear together as readouts, where topology and tallies become lawful, where persistence and memory become possible. Part 18 sits at the end of the first movement. It closes the permission layer by showing that even the instrument of closure, reason itself, presupposes phi. This is why Part 18 feels like a loop closing. We began by naming phi as comparability. We end by realizing comparability is the precondition of naming, of logic, of proof, of understanding. Now, there is one last danger we must neutralize, because otherwise, a listener might misunderstand the entire program right here. The danger is this, that someone hears phi precedes logic and concludes, so logic is unreliable, or so anything goes, or so reason is just a habit. No. That would be a betrayal of the firewall. Phi does not weaken logic. Phi explains why logic has force. Logic feels necessary because comparison is unavoidable. Logic feels binding because once you agree to compare consistently, contradictions are not forbidden by God, they are forbidden by the discipline of matching. A contradiction is a sock placed in two incompatible piles under the same rule. It is the violation of your own sorting. So the program does not say abandon logic. It says understand the soil logic grows from. It says you don't get to declare logic self-grounding because logic is a practice performed inside comparability. And this yields a quiet, practical shift in how we do science. Science is often narrated as if logic floats above reality, and we simply apply it. But in holophase terms, science is a licensed practice of comparison. Compare measurements across windows. Compare predicted patterns to observed patterns. Compare reconstructions across pipelines. Compare claims to falsifiers. If the foundation is phi, then the scientific method is not a magical access to truth. It is a disciplined form of comparability. It succeeds when comparability is licensed. It fails when comparability is broken, by noise, by incoherence, by smuggling. So part 18 is not just philosophy. It is operational hygiene. It tells you why the firewall is not optional. The firewall is the guardian of honest comparison. It prevents us from matching a claim to a conclusion using rules that we never licensed. Now, because we are holophase native, we must touch energy correctly if we touch it at all. So let's say it once, cleanly. Energy is a tally, not a substance. And tallies presuppose comparison. To count is to compare. This occurrence is the same kind of event as that occurrence. A tally is sock pairing across time-like readouts later. So even energy, as tally, depends on phi. It cannot ground phi. It is grounded. Now we approach the end, and I want to give you the one sentence you can carry. One sentence that can sit in your pocket and keep working long after the episode ends. Listener carry. To think at all, you need phi. Not as poetry, as architecture. Now let's return one last time to our sock room, because repetition here is not decoration. It is proof by familiarity. You are in the room. The pile is there. Your friend asks you to pair socks. If you have comparability, you can do it. If you lose comparability, everything collapses. Not just the pairing, but the meaning of correct pairing. Not just the meaning of match, but the meaning of mistake. And not just the meaning of mistake, but the meaning of rule. That is logic. Logic is what you get when you take comparability seriously, and you promise not to cheat. Phi is the capacity that makes such a promise possible. So part 18 closes the silent ground with a final, almost shocking calm. The universe does not need logic as a primitive law hovering above it. Logic is what arises when comparability becomes organized, stable, and publicly enforceable under licensing. We have not yet stepped into the public layer of differentiated phi in this part. We have not yet told the story of how omega, kappa, nu appear together. We have only secured the most basic right, the right for therefore to mean something at all. And that right is purchased by phi. Now we can finally say, without drama, what we have woven in this part. We showed that every act of reasoning, every proof, decision, inference, and contradiction depends on comparison, and comparison is phi. Therefore, phi is the prerequisite of logic, not the product of logic. That is the essence. And now, gently, we can open the door to what comes next. In the next part, we leave the permission layer and approach the transition where possibility becomes public, where the silent ground begins to carry readable change, where the first certified readouts of time, space, and motion arrive together, not as containers, but as shadows cast by phi when phi becomes licensed as change. For now, hold the sentence. To think at all, you need phi. End of part 18. Memory hook. To think at all, you need phi. Prediction. All logic reduces to comparison. AI requires comparison as primitive. Falsification. Complete logic system without comparison. Reasoning without distinction. Using logic to point to what makes logic possible. Self-reference, not contradiction. Peace be upon you.